To put value in pleasure and pain, regarding a given quantity of pain as balancing a given quantity of pleasure, is to bring to practical ethics a worthy intention to be clear in what is more precious, an undoubted honesty not always found in those moralists who maintain the opposite opinion and care more for edification than for truth. For in spite of all logical and psychological scruples, conduct that should not justify itself somehow by the satisfaction secured and the pains avoided would not justify itself at all. The most instinctive and unavoidable desire is forthwith chilled if you discover that its ultimate end is to be a preponderance of suffering, and what arrests this desire is not fear or wickedness, but conscience, in its most categorical and sacred guise. Who would not be ashamed to acknowledge or to propose so inhuman an action? By sad experience, rooted impulses may be transformed or even obliterated, and quite intelligibly, for the idea of pain is already the sign and the beginning of a certain stoppage. To imagine failure is to interpret ideally a felt inhibition. To prophesy a check would be impossible, but for an incipient moment already meeting an incipient arrest. Intensified, this prophecy becomes its own fulfillment and totally inhibits the opposed tendency. Therefore, a mind that foresees pain to be the ultimate result of action cannot continue unreservedly to act, seeing that its foresight is the conscious transcript of a recoil already occurring. Conversely, the mind that surrenders itself wholly to any impulse must think that its execution would be delightful. A perfectly wise and representative will, therefore, would aim only at what, in its attainment, could continue to be aimed at and improved. And this is another way of saying that its aim would secure the maximum of satisfaction eventually possible. In spite, however, of this involution of pain and pleasure in all deliberate forecast and volition, pain and pleasure are not the ultimate sources of value. A correct psychology and logic cannot allow that eventual and, in strictness, unpresentable feeling can determine any act or volition, but must insist that, on the contrary, all beliefs about future experience, with all premonition of its emotional quality, is based on actual impulse and feeling, so that the source of value is nothing but the inner fountain of life and imagination, and the object of pursuit nothing but the ideal object, counterpart of the present demand. Abstract satisfaction is not pursued, but, if the will and the environment are constant, satisfaction will necessarily be felt in achieving the object desired. A rejection of hedonistic psychology, therefore, by no means involves any opposition to eudaimonism in ethics. Eudaimonism is another name for wisdom. There is no other moral morality. Any system that, for some sinister reason, should absolve itself from goodwill toward all creatures and make it somehow a duty to secure their misery would be clearly disloyal to reason, humanity, and justice. Nor would it be hard, in that case, to point out what superstition, what fantastic obsession, or what private fury had made those persons blind to prudence and kindness in so plain a matter. Happiness is the only satisfaction of life. Where happiness fails, existence remains a mad and lamentable experiment. The question, however, what happiness shall consist in, its complexion, if it should once arise, can only be determined by reference to natural demands and capacities, so that, while satisfaction by the attainment of ends can alone justify their pursuit, this pursuit itself must exist first and be spontaneous, thereby fixing the goals of endeavor and distinguishing the states in which satisfaction might be found. Natural disposition, therefore, is the principle of preference that makes morality and happiness possible. The standard of value, like every standard, must be one. Pleasures and pains are not only infinitely diverse, but, even if reduced to their total bulk and abstract opposition, they remain two. their values must be compared, and obviously neither one can be the standard by which to judge the other. This standard is an ideal involved in the judgment passed, whatever that judgment may be. Thus, when Petrarch says that 1,000 pleasures are not worth one pain, he establishes an ideal of value deeper than either pleasure or pain, an ideal which makes a life of satisfaction marred by a single pang, an offense, and a horror to his soul. If our demand for rationality is less acute, and the miscellaneous affirmations of the will carry us along with a well-fed indifference to some single tragedy within us, we may aver that single pain is only the 1,000th part of 1,000 pleasures, and that a life so balanced is 999 times better than nothing. This judgment, for all of its air of mathematical calculation, in truth expresses a choice as irrational as Petrarch's. It merely means that, as a matter of fact, the mixed prospect presented to us attracts our wills and attracts them vehemently, so that the only possible criterion for the relative values of pains and pleasures is the will that chooses among them or among combinations of them. Nor can the intensity of pleasures and pains, apart from the physical violence of their expression, be judged by any other standard than by the power they have, when represented, to control the will's movement. Here we come upon one of those initial irrationalities in the world, which theories of all sorts, since their attempts to find rationality in things, are in serious danger of overlooking. In estimating the value of any experience, our endeavor, our pretension, is to weigh the value which that experience possesses when it is actual. But to weigh is to compare, and to compare is to represent. Since the transcendental isolation and self-sufficiency of actual experience precludes its lying side by side with another datum, like two objects given in a single consciousness. Successive values, to be compared, must be represented, but the conditions of representation are such that they rob objects of the values they had at their first appearance to substitute the values they possess at their recurrence. For representation mirrors consciousness only by mirroring its objects, and the emotional reaction upon these objects cannot be represented directly, but is approached by indirect methods, through an imitation or assimilation of will to will and emotion to emotion. Only by the instrumentality of signs, like gesture or language, can we bring ourselves to reproduce, in some measure, an absent experience, and to feel some premonition of its absolute value. Apart from very elaborate and cumulative suggestions to the contrary, we should always attribute to an event in every other experience the value which its image now had in our own. But in that case, the pathetic fallacy would be present, for a volitional reaction upon an idea in one vital context is no index to what the volitional reaction would be in another vital context upon the situation which that idea represents. This divergence falsifies all representation of life and renders it initially cruel, sentimental, and mythical. We dislike to trample on a flower because its form makes a kind of blossoming in our own fancy, which we call beauty. But we laugh at pangs we endured in childhood and feel no tremor at the incalculable sufferings of all mankind beyond our horizon, because no imitable image is involved to start a contrite thrill in our own bosom. The same cruelty appears in aesthetic pleasures, in lust, war, and ambition, in the illusions of desire and memory, in the unsympathetic quality of theory everywhere, which regards the uniformities of cause and effect and the beauties of law as a justification for the inherent evils in the experience described, and the unjust judgments, finally, of mystic optimism that sinks so completely into its subjective commotion as to mistake the suspension of all discriminating and representative faculties for a true union in things, and the blur of its own ecstasy for a universal glory. These pleasures are all on the sensuous plane, the plane of levity and unintentional wickedness, but in their own sphere, they have their own value. Aesthetic and speculative emotions make an important contribution to the total worth of existence, but they do not abolish the evils of that experience on which they reflect with such ruthless satisfaction. The satisfaction is due to a private flood of emotion, submerging the images present in fancy, or to the exercise of a new intellectual function, like that of abstraction, synthesis, or comparison. Such a faculty, when fully developed, is capable of yielding pleasures as intense and voluminous as those proper to rudimentary animal functions, wrongly supposed to be more vital. The acme of vitality lies in the most comprehensive and penetrating thought. The rhythms, the sweep, the impetuosity of impassioned contemplation not only contain in themselves a great vitality and potency, but they often succeed in engaging the lower functions in a sympathetic vibration, and we see the whole body and soul wrapped, as we say, and borne along by the harmonies of imagination and thought. In these fugitive moments of intoxication, the detail of truth is submerged and forgotten. The luminous blindness, which in these cases takes an extreme form, is present in principle throughout all reflection. Something yet unrealized irresistibly solicited the will and seemed to promise incomparable ecstasy, and perhaps it yields an indescribable moment of excitement and triumph, a moment only half appropriated into waking experience, so fleeting is it, and so unfit the mind to possess or retain its tenser attitudes. The same situation, if revived in memory, when the system is in an opposite and relaxed state, forfeits all power to attract, and fills the mind rather with aversion and disgust. For all violent pleasures, as Shakespeare says, are cruel and not to be trusted. A bliss and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated. Past reason, indeed, for although an impulsive injustice is inherent in the very nature of representation and cannot be overcome altogether, yet reason, by attending to all the evidences that can be gathered, and by confronting the first pronouncement by others, fetched from every quarter of experience, has power to minimize the error and reach a practically just estimate of absent values. This projection of interest into excellence takes place mechanically and is in the first instance irrational. Did all glow die out from memory and expectation, the events represented remaining unchanged, we should be incapable of assigning any value to those events, just as, if eyes were lacking, we should be incapable of assigning color to the world, which would, notwithstanding, remain as it is at present. So fame could never be regarded as a good if the idea of fame gave no pleasure. Yet now, because the idea pleases, the reality is regarded as a good, absolute, and intrinsic. This moral hypothesis, involved in the love of fame, could never be rationalized, but would subsist unmitigated or die out unobserved were it not associated with other conceptions and other habits of estimating values. For the passions are humanized only by being juxtaposed and forced to live together. As fame is not man's only goal, and the realization of it comes into manifold relations with other interests no less vivid, we are able to criticize the impulse to pursue it. Fame may be the consequence of benefits conferred upon mankind. In that case, the abstract desire for fame would be reinforced and, as it were, justified by its congruity with the more voluminous and stable desire to benefit our fellow men. Or again, the achievements which ensure fame and the genius that wins it probably involve a high degree of vitality, and many profound inward satisfactions to the man of genius himself, so that again the abstract love of fame would be reinforced by the independent and more rational desire for a noble and comprehensive experience. On the other hand, the minds of posterity, whose homage is craved by the ambitious man, will probably have very false conceptions of his thoughts and purposes. What they will call by his name will be, in a great measure, a fiction of their own fancy, not his portrait at all. Would Caesar recognize himself in the current notions of him, drawn from some school history, or perhaps from Shakespeare's satirical portrait? Would Christ recognize himself upon our altars, or in the romances about him constructed by imaginative critics? And not only is remote experience thus hopelessly lost and misrepresented, but even this nominal memorial ultimately disappears. The love of fame, if tempered by these and similar considerations, would tend to take a place in man's ideal, such as its roots in human nature and its functions in human progress might seem to justify. It would be rationalized in the only sense in which any primary desire can be rationalized, namely, by being combined with all others in a consistent whole. How much of it would survive a thorough sifting and criticism may well remain in doubt. The result would naturally differ for different temperaments and in different states of society. The fact that value is attributed to absent experience, according to the value experience has in representation, appears again in one of the most curious anomalies in human life: the exorbitant interest which thought and reflection take in the form of experience, and the slight account they make of its intensity or volume. Seasickness and childbirth when they are over, the pangs of despised love when that love is finally forgotten or requited, the travail of sin when once salvation is assured, all melt away and dissolve like a morning mist, leaving a clear sky without a vestige of sorrow. So also, with merely remembered and not reproducible pleasures, the buoyancy of youth when absurdity is not yet tedious, the rapture of sport or passion, the immense peace found in mystical surrender to the universal, all these generous ardors count for nothing when they are once gone. The memory of them cannot cure a fit of the blues, nor raise an irritable mortal above some petty act of malice or vengeance, or reconcile him to foul weather. A note of Horace, on the other hand, a scientific monograph, or a well-written page of music is a better antidote to melancholy than thinking on all the happiness which one's own life or that of the universe may ever have contained. Why should overwhelming masses of suffering and joy affect imagination so little, while it responds sympathetically to aesthetic and intellectual irritants of very slight intensity, objects that, it must be confessed, are of almost no importance to the welfare of mankind? Why should we be so easily awed by artistic genius and exalt men whose works we know only by name, perhaps, and whose influence upon society has been infinitesimal, like a Pindar or a Leonardo? There is a prodigious selfishness in dreams. They live perfectly deaf and invulnerable amid the cries of the real world. Thus it appears that the great figures of art or religion, together with all historic and imaginative ideals, advance insensibly on the values they represent. The image has more luster than the original, and is often the more important and influential fact. Things are esteemed as they weigh in representation. A memorable thing, people say in their eulogies, little thinking to touch the ground of their praise. For things are called great because they are memorable. They are not remembered because they are great. The deepest pangs, the highest joys, the widest influences are lost to perception in its haste, and if in some rational moment reconstructed and acknowledged, are soon forgotten again and cut off from living consideration. But the emptiest experience, even the most pernicious tendency, if embodied in a picturesque image, if reverberating in the mind with a pleasant echo, is idolized and enshrined. Fortunate indeed was Achilles that Homer sang of him, and fortunate the poets that make a public titillation out of their sorrows and ignorance. This imputed and posthumous fortune is the only happiness they have. The favors of memory are extended to those feeble realities and denied to the massive substance of daily life. When life dies, when what was present becomes memory, its ghost flits still among the living, feared or worshipped, not for the experience it once possessed, but for the aspect it now wears. Yet this injustice and representation, speculatively so offensive, is practically excusable, for it is in one sense right and useful that all things, whatever their original or inherent dignity, should be valued at each moment only by their present function and utility. The error involved in attributing value to the past is naturally aggravated when values are to be assigned to the future. In the latter case, imagination cannot be controlled by circumstantial evidence, and is consequently the only basis for judgment. But as a conception of a thing naturally evokes an emotion different from that involved in its presence, ideals of what is desirable for the future contain no warrant that the experience desired would, when actual, prove to be acceptable and good. An ideal carries no extrinsic assurance that its realization would be a benefit. To convince ourselves that an ideal has rational authority and represents a better life than the actual one it is contrasted with, we must control the prophetic image by as many circumlocutions as possible. As in the case of fame, we must buttress or modify our spontaneous judgment with all the other judgments that the object envisaged can prompt. We must make our ideal harmonize with all interests, rather than with a part only. The possible error remains even then, but a prudent mind will always accept the risk of error when it has made every possible correction. A rational will is not a will that has reason for its basis, or that possesses any better proof that it is well inspired than the oracle of a living will. The rationality possible of the will lies not in its source, but in its method. An ideal cannot wait for its realization to prove its validity. To deserve loyalty, it needs only to be adequate as an ideal, that is, to express completely what the soul at present demands, and to do justice to all extant interests.